Generic greetings and welcome to Science Insanity, a channel dedicated to bringing my love of science fiction in all its wondrous, absurd glory to you, the viewer. Today, a new type of content for Sci, one that I have not done before. Instead of the normal lore videos with my co-host Steve, today we're going to be going over a battle breakdown. Before we get into the topic, however, I must shill, for I am simply a greedy capitalist begging for money. If you'd like to get access to all of Science Insanity's content a day early with all the stuff we normally have to cut for YouTube and to keep the runtime down, go check out our Patreon, and if you're feeling generous, buy me a coffee or feed Steve. It is greatly appreciated. And if space bucks are a little tight, then do me a solid. Like, subscribe, and spread the video around. Every little bit helps. And with that, let's introduce our topic of the day proper. We are going to be going over the Donnager battle from Season 1, when the crew of the Canterbury, the survivors, get picked up by the Donny, and immediately get attacked by a number of stealth ships that had been trailing it, attempting to reach those survivors first. Before we get into anything else though, we should cover a little bit of background information about why the battle happened and what led up to it. During the events of The Expanse Season 1, Episode 2, The Big Empty, our main cast and functional protagonists respond to a distress signal from the Scopuli, a disabled freighter drifting next to an asteroid. During their investigation, the crew of the Night uncover a beacon responsible for the distress signal. However, the tech is more advanced than anything they've ever seen, and so wrongly assume it's Martian in origin. After an unknown stealth ship ambushes the crew during their investigation, destroying their parent ship and vital ice hauler for the Belters, the Canterbury, as well as the Scopuli with the resulting debris storm, the crew, along with their shuttle the Night, are sent drifting through space while damaged. The unknown stealth ship that had attacked them similarly flees into open space in order to escape the explosion. Sometime later, after detecting the explosion of the Canterbury and the distress signal from the Night, the MCRN Donnager sets course to investigate and render assistance if needed. On the way, however, the Donnager detects an incredibly suspicious and incredibly unknown engine signature burning hard to decelerate on an intercept course for the Night, similar to the Donnager. Captain Teresa Yao orders the crew to alert and the Donnager to be put the proverbial pedal to the metal in order to get there first. Upon getting close to the Night, James Holden took it upon himself to send a system-wide message stating that they were survivors of the Canterbury's destruction and claiming that the tech they found was of Martian origin, and by proxy and directly, blaming Mars for the ice hauler's destruction. He did this in order to try and buy negotiating power with the Martians, or as he called it, insurance, to stop them from simply being tortured and executed or shipped off to a prison colony on Mars somewhere. Because the government doesn't want you to know this, but criminals are free labor. The Donnager managed to beat the unknown engine signatures to the Night first, making contact with it and bringing it into the hangar bay, where the crew was then promptly arrested and interrogated. The survivors of the Canterbury were now on board the Martian warship with vital information on what had actually happened. The tensions in the system due to Holden's message were escalating rapidly, and the unknown bogey was ignoring communications requests and continuing its burn to intercept the Donnager. And that sets the stage wonderfully for the upcoming fight. Now, on to the battle. As the target continued its approach vector, Captain Yao made one last attempt to communicate with the oncoming vessels, stating that it was violating in no uncertain terms the Donnager's no-touch-me zone, and if they continued, it would be fired upon. The unknown vessel responded by jamming the Donnager's communications and cutting engines. As the unknown ship entered the extremes of possible combat range, it began to reorient itself, and this is where it became clear that there wasn't a single ship. And apologies for the nerd interception here from the ongoing breakdown and current events of the battle, but I have to talk about the tactics employed here by the stealth ships, and it is incredibly cool that something like this happened, and I'm very sad it doesn't happen anywhere near enough in science fiction, in my opinion. Every ship would technically create something I would call its shadow, essentially the space on the opposite side of it from an observer that the ship occludes from sight. If an observer is very close, the shadow could be massive, even from a very small ship. And if the observer is very far away, the shadow could be quite small, even if it's a very large ship. If you were approaching from far away, it would be possible to line up multiple ships near and hide all of them in the shadow of the very first one, so long as they mirrored the movements and generally kept themselves in the good orientation. then you'd be able to functionally hide an entire fleet behind the drive plume of the very first ship. This is how the fleet of unknown stealth ships managed to hide and get so close to the donnager without revealing their numbers, the stealth systems also adding to the confusion of their sensor profile. The ships cut their thrust at the same time, and it's revealed that there are 6 unknown vessels on an intercept course. They reorient and spread out into combat formations before reigniting their engines and accelerating hard towards the donnager once again. The earlier message attempt from Captain Yao to communicate with and dissuade the incoming ships was met only by the vessels jamming the donnager, and the arrogant exclamation from Captain Yao that whatever these ships came to do, it had just turned into a suicide mission. Now cut off from outside communication to either call for help or report the situation, the stage for the fight is set. 6 as yet unknown and heavily armed Amun-ra class stealth ships against the pride of the Martian fleet, the namesake of the donnager-class battleships herself. Before the fighting begins, if you'd like to see a breakdown of the donnys' capabilities and armaments to better understand the battle, check out the video pinned in the corner. Shameless self-promotion. The 6 stealth ships began their assault positioned to relative front port side of the donnager, revealing several concealed torpedo launch tubes and firing a heavy volley of long-range torpedoes at the donnager. And here we can see the asymmetric engagement between these ships in both tactics and defensive strategies as both volleys of torpedoes pass each other. The Amun-ra class ships, being far smaller than the donnager, have a paltry number of PDCs with which to defend themselves as a consequence of needing to be designed for stealth. Instead, they rely on maneuvers and the aforementioned stealth systems to obfuscate and scramble the guidance of incoming torpedoes rather than outright destroying them. As the donnager's volley of torpedoes closes first, since they're larger and faster, one of the attacking vessels suffers a direct hit to the bow and crumples under the explosion upon impact, disintegrating as it loses structural integrity. The donnager has drawn first blood. The rest, however, are unharmed, as most of the Martian munitions have either drifted off course or missed as their guidance failed to hold a proper lock on their targets. The few that did manage to stay locked on were dealt with by the relatively few PDCs that the stealth ships had. In the preceding minutes it takes for the stealth ship's initial volley of torpedoes to reach the donnager, we see the mighty vessel bring its point defense grid online and begin tracking and targeting all incoming threats. While the guidance on the stealth ship's torpedoes are far better than even the Martian munitions, which were thought to be some of the best in the system, the vast majority were still blown out of the void by the overwhelming power of the donnager's defense grid, with only one torpedo barely failing to make impact on the donnager's engines, while the one singular torpedo that did strike home by minor miracle managed to score a critical hit on the donnager's reactor, damaging it. I also feel it's prudent to mention that this fight is also asymmetric in its goals. The donnager is fighting to kill, while the stealth ships are attempting to disable, not destroy, for reasons that will become clear later. In response to this and the shrinking distance between the two forces, Captain Yao orders the donnager to shift power from the torpedo systems, which now didn't have the range to be effective, to the railguns, as well as sucking up power from literally everything else they could, because those giant suckers are an absolute power hog. As the donnager's twin ultra-heavy bow hammer railguns, and yes, we do have to put the respect on their full name every time, came online, they turned to target the incoming stealth ships, now well within the assured kill range. The donnager fired. The first shot scored a hit on the front of one of the attackers. While it isn't stated, I believe the railgun round detonated one of the torpedo magazines at the fore of the ship. The impact angle and the fact the explosion comes from the front of the vessel rather than the middle rear where the reactor is suggests a more conventional explosion. Either way, kill 2 for the donnager. Moments later, however, the command crew were shocked as the ship was hit several times in rapid succession by a volley of railguns mounted in the stealth ships. At this point in the Expanse history, the Amun-ra class, despite being significantly longer than the Rocinante, the corvette-class Martian frigate, was the smallest ship known to ever carry railguns of any size, much less the rapid recharge and fire model that was currently hammering the donny. While the stealth ship's railguns came as a shock, they didn't come as a death sentence. Instead of aiming for the donnager's stricken reactor in an attempt to put the ship down, they targeted various subsystems such as the PDC emplacements and vulnerable crew positions. This hail of railgun slugs forced Captain Yao to order the donnager's engines shut down, as the power draw of the railguns and the mounting damage would have threatened to overload the drives if they continued. This meant that the donnager was no longer capable of hard maneuvers or of controlling spacing in the engagement anymore, lending a large tactical advantage to the stealth ships. An advantage they would attempt to use as they rushed the donnager. However, another shot from the Donny's good old railguns cored the third enemy casualty of the battle, destroying now 3 enemy ships, a full half of the fleet. As the remaining 3 moved in on the stricken vessel, they would find its defense grid damaged, but not disabled, and certainly not ineffective. It's at this time that the donnager's CIC identifies the appearance and some cursory information about the stealth ships, prompting James Holden to notice that these are the same ships that blew up the Canterbury, and he is promptly ordered off of the donnager along with Sergeant Lopez in order to return to Mars and explain everything that's going on to try to get to the bottom of what's happening, as they make the conclusion that somebody is trying to blame Mars for blowing up the Canterbury and start a war. A 4th stealth ship attempted to do a close flyover of the donnager by this point, intending to launch its breaching pods as it strafed by. However, before it could get the chance, several PDCs were retargeted to intercept it, riddling the vessel with hundreds of tungsten slugs and scoring critical hits almost immediately. Without being able to launch its breaching pods, the 4th Amun-ra class ship suffered cascading explosions that reduced it to scrap, as first its magazine, then its reactor in quick succession exploded. 4 down, 2 to go. Unfortunately, the level of focus on the lead ship of the 3 charging the donnager meant that the last 2 were able to readjust their course and come around to fly past the donnager in parallel, launching their breaching pods as they did and boarding the vessel along its entire length. I feel it's prudent to also mention that they decided to target the side of the donnager that they were pummeling with railgun rounds in order to disable their PDCs, and this was to prevent said point defense cannons from blowing the breaching pods out of the void and completely foiling their plan before it even got off the proverbial spaceship. The remaining 2 Amun-ra stealth ships at this point peeled away from the donnager, burning in the opposite direction to open distance from the remaining point defense cannons and allow their boarding teams to do their work without risking furthering their already heavy naval losses. The damage, power loss, crew deaths, and unprecedented reality of being boarded caused the crew of the donnager and the Martian Marine complement to be utterly confused and disorganized in the immediate aftermath of, well, the boarding action. The unknown forces fighting more like machines than men, as they proved more than willing to throw their lives away if it meant accomplishing their mission. Captain Yao ordered the survivors of the Canterbury to board the Tachi, a Corvette-class ship docked in the donnager's hangar bay, and luckily undamaged by the railgun and torpedo exchange. By this point, the boarders had disabled or taken control of much of the ship, enough so that the remaining 2 stealth ships felt comfortable enough to return and moved alongside the donnager. The Tachi had escaped the donnager's hangars by basically blasting its way out and pointing its guns at anyone who would attempt to stop it, and began to burn hard away from the site of the battle. Captain Yao somberly commented how she never believed that they could lose before activating the ship's self-destruct. Whether or not the stealth ships would have given chase to the Tachi is unknown, as moments later the donnager's reactor went critical and exploded. And judging by the size of the explosion and the fact all 3 remaining ships were all but atomized in its conflagration, that's a big word, I ate a thesaurus this morning for breakfast, I would also assume that the self-destruct included detonating the remaining nuclear warheads on board, and thus, the battle came to an end. In the aftermath, the donnager was destroyed, lost with all hands, only the survivors of the Canterbury escaping to continue on the events of the show in the Tachi, soon to be renamed the Rocinante. The loss of the donnager was a great tragedy for the Martian Navy and accounted for many hurt feelings and an enormous amount of rustled jimmies. However, I think the, and pardon my language, stubborn old bitch of a warship put up a hell of a good fight and gave far better than she got, considering how incredibly ambushed and surprised the crew was, and the fact they were fighting a significantly more advanced enemy that they had no prior knowledge of. For the stealth ships, however, their fleet was all but annihilated. Originally, 9 Amun-ra class ships were built, with the namesake later being cannibalized to accelerate the construction of the others after its testbed had completed. One of them, the Anubis, was lost to proto-molecule shenanigans of the, body horror type. Hard to fly your ship when the entire crew is soup. And with the destruction of those 6 stealth ships, Protogen Corporation's navy, their designer and operator, was left functionally without a fleet. Only the escort assigned to Thoth Station survived. And that's the end of the battle. First and foremost, and before we end off, a huge thank you to Size patrons. You guys forced me to re-record this because another one of you showed up and I gotta read your names off. But your support is greatly appreciated despite your shenanigans, because you allow Psy to get more equipment, upgrade our stuff, keep moving forward, and motivate me to get off my ass and make the channel more professional and more creative, because if people are going to throw money at me, I damn well better deliver you something. So, thank you all very much, with a special thank you to Terry Higgins, 11 Bravo Crunchy, Augie, and David G for feeding Steve so I don't have to. Thank you very much. And with thanks having been said, before we fully end off, I would like to know what you all thought about it for anyone that made it this far in, considering that this is a first for Science Insanity, having never actually made these kinds of battle reports or such a heavily edited and scripted video before, as well as the fact that, you know, co-host Steve isn't really around for this. I would really like to know what you guys think and whether or not you enjoyed it. If you did, there could potentially be more of these, couple videos every month to supplement the normal once-a-week podcast. And if you didn't like it, well, I got a few other types of content ideas that are coming in the future as well. So look forward to that stuff whenever I decide to get around to making them. And with that, the video is over. Check back in a couple of days, because midweek we're having an episode on the Cylon Base Star, the wonderful toaster weapon of human termination. Outros are hard. Okay, bye-bye!